A group of students decided to go camping together during their holiday. There were 5 of them in total: Jeff, who was driving, and his girlfriend Marcy in the front seats, while Karen, her backup boyfriend Paul, and the lone wolf Bert sat in the back. Before heading into the mountains, they stopped at a convenience store to pick up some supplies. Sitting on a bench outside the store was a cold, quiet little boy. Paul, trying to be friendly, approached him and greeted him warmly, only to be bitten unexpectedly. Hearing the commotion, the boy's father, who also owned the convenience store, rushed out. He scolded his son harshly, but then sincerely apologized to Paul. It turned out the boy suffered from a rare condition that made him uncontrollably aggressive when upset. The entire town was afraid of him. Considering he was just a child and seeing how apologetic the father was, Paul didn't press the matter. He went alone to a nearby river to clean his wound, while the others headed inside to pick out their daily necessities. When the father overheard them planning to spend a few days in the woods, he recommended buying a hunting rifle, warning them about the wild animals that often appeared in the forest. For safety reasons, the group took his advice seriously and decided to purchase the rifle. Just as they finished checking out and were about to leave, the store owner suddenly called out to Bert. It turned out Bert had sneaked a piece of chocolate without paying, and the owner had caught him. The owner didn't make a big deal out of it. He just asked Bert to hand over the chocolate. But Bert, feeling defiant, couldn't resist mocking the owner on his way out. Following the map, the group finally arrived at their destination, a rundown cabin deep in the woods. After dropping off their bags in their respective rooms, everyone went off to do their own thing. Jeff and his girlfriend stayed in their room, quickly getting cozy. Paul took Karen down to the river for a swim, while the lonely Bert grabbed the newly bought hunting rifle and headed into the forest to try his luck hunting. But his aim was terrible. Every shot perfectly missed the squirrels. Meanwhile, Paul and Karen lounged comfortably on a wooden raft floating in the middle of the river. Paul had been the perpetual backup boyfriend for a long time and was eager to make things official. Seizing the moment, he confessed his feelings to Karen. But as usual, things didn't go as planned. Just when Paul thought Karen was about to reject him, she gave him a glimmer of hope. And just when he thought he had her, she deliberately dodged the topic. Karen always kept him guessing, sometimes close, sometimes distant, leaving Paul hooked like a fish on a line. Meanwhile, Bert was still coming up empty-handed. Just as he was about to give up and head back, he noticed some disturbed leaves on the ground ahead. Thinking it might be a small animal, he spotted a fleeting shadow and immediately pulled the trigger. But instead of silence, a man's voice rang out, startling Bert. He quickly ran over to investigate. In front of him stood a man covered in sores and wounds, his face twisted in pain, clearly infected by some kind of virus. Luckily, Bert's shot hadn't hit any vital spots. The man begged for help. Bert wanted to help, but was terrified the man might be contagious. So he told him he'd drive to town to get help and instructed him to wait right where he was. But the man refused to listen, insisting on following Bert. With no other choice, Bert fired a warning shot to keep him at bay. The shot startled the man so much that he lost his balance and fell back down. Back at the cabin, Bert didn't seek help or tell the others about what had happened. He was afraid that if anyone found out he'd fired a gun, it would cause him unnecessary trouble. So he pretended like nothing had happened. As night fell, the group gathered around the campfire, roasting food and listening intently as Paul told scary stories. Just as they were getting really into it, a strange man suddenly emerged from the woods, startling everyone. It turned out he was just passing by, noticed their fire and storytelling, and found it interesting enough to join them. But in the middle of the night, out in the wilderness, the group was naturally cautious of this stranger. So when the man asked to join their campfire circle, Jeff politely declined, saying they were having a private conversation. To their surprise, the man pulled out a large bag of marijuana. The group's attitude shifted instantly, and they warmly invited him to join. Karen, ignoring Paul's feelings, pulled the man close and curiously asked his name. He said his name was Justin, a student at Berkeley University. Karen got excited immediately. She was about to start at Berkeley herself. As the two chatted enthusiastically, Paul clearly looked a little jealous. To lighten the mood, Bert suggested they make a bet. For the rest of the night, they would only drink beer and no water. Whoever lost would have to hand over all their valuables. None of them expected that this seemingly harmless bet would somehow tie into what was about to happen. Suddenly, a loud clap of thunder echoed through the sky, signaling an approaching storm. They had no choice but to cut the party short. Despite the brief time together, the atmosphere had been pretty good. Jeff invited Justin to come inside and take shelter from the rain. Justin was happy to join, but said he needed to head back first. He was camping alone too, with his tent less than half an hour away. Worried the rain might ruin his tent, he said he'd quickly go back to secure his stuff and return right away. Before long, Those inside the cabin heard a knock at the door. Expecting Justin, they opened it, but to their shock, it was the man Bert had encountered earlier while hunting. The man's sudden appearance terrified them even more. His face was now a grotesque mass of blood and flesh. He claimed he needed to see a doctor and begged for their help. Bert panicked and tried to hide his presence, but the man immediately spotted him. Unaware of the man's illness, Bert refused him entry. His real motive was to cover up the fact that he had fired a gun. The others wanted to help the man, but were confused and frustrated by Bert's stubbornness. Jeff tried to call for medical assistance, but found there was no signal. As tensions rose, the man suddenly got into their car, attempting to drive off to get help himself. This was blatant robbery, and the group wasn't about to let him get away. They grabbed their weapons and stepped outside to stop him. Jeff, the owner of the car, grew furious as he desperately pounded on the driver's window, yelling at the man to get out immediately. Bert fired another warning shot to scare him off. But suddenly, the man's condition worsened dramatically. He vomited a torrent of fresh blood, splattering the inside of the car everywhere. Seeing their vehicle contaminated, the group stopped holding back and launched an all-out attack. Once outside, the man slowly advanced toward the two girls. Luckily, Marcy had some pepper spray, which she used to push him back for the moment. Paul rushed over, trying to play hero with a torch to scare the man away. But instead, the torch accidentally ignited the man's jacket. Flames quickly engulfed him, and amid his agonizing screams, the man vanished into the woods. Back inside the cabin, the group was still shaken. After all, a life had been taken, and they worried about what would happen if the police showed up. Bert, however, remained optimistic. Maybe the rain would put out the fire on the man's body. Besides, the man had looked like he was already dying. Even if the police did come, they could always claim it was an accident. For now, they decided to deal with everything in the morning. The heavy rain poured through the night. The memories of what had happened weighed on everyone's minds, making sleep difficult. When morning finally came, they planned to split up to find help and repair the damaged car. Bert, Jeff, and Marcy each headed off in different directions to seek assistance from local residents. Paul and Karen stayed behind at the cabin. What they didn't know was that the man burned to a crisp the night before had ended up lifeless in a nearby reservoir. It seemed he had jumped in to put out the fire. Worse yet, his corpse, carrying a deadly virus, had contaminated the water source, and that reservoir happened to supply the cabin with drinking water. Unaware of the danger, Paul filled a cup and handed it to Karen. Karen drank the tainted water. Meanwhile, Bert and Jeff found a nearby farm and planned to ask the farmer for help. But what they saw instead was horrifying. The farmer's wife was brutally killing one of her own pigs in a fit of rage. Noticing the two strangers, she began to vent her frustration. An infected animal had appeared in the mountains, spreading the virus to all the livestock. Her hard-raised pigs were no exception. No wonder she was so furious. The two men didn't know what to say, so they simply explained their purpose, asking if there was a mechanic nearby, since their car had broken down. The farmer's wife was willing to help and led them inside, intending to use the radio to call for assistance from the town. That's when Bert and Jeff noticed a photo on the wall of the man they had set on fire the night before. It turned out the man was the farmer's husband. Fearing their secret might be exposed, the two quickly made up an excuse and left, avoiding using the radio. Meanwhile, Marcy was paddling a small boat across a lake and spotted a house on the shore. But when she arrived, the door was wide open and no one seemed to be home. After calling out a few times with no answer, Marcy decided to enter. To her surprise, she found Jeff and Bert inside. It turned out the two men had left the farm and were wandering nearby. They had come across this house, but found no one home and no radio to call for help. At this point, Marcy started to worry. Had the police already shown up? Her fears were confirmed when a police officer knocked on the cabin door. He explained that he had been patrolling nearby the night before when he heard gunshots, so he came to check out what was going on. Trying to stay calm, Paul explained the situation to the officer. He said they had been having a party when a strange man suddenly barged in, trying to steal their car. With no other choice, they had to fight back. But Paul left out one crucial detail. They had set the man on fire. The officer didn't seem overly interested in the details and mostly just went through the motions. Instead, he asked about their party. The two ended up chatting casually, and Paul quickly realized the cop was a bit of a loose cannon. Surprisingly, that actually made Paul feel better. With a laid-back, somewhat irresponsible officer like this, their secret was unlikely to come out anytime soon. Before leaving, the cop assured Paul he would report the incident truthfully. He promised they'd catch the madman soon and that Paul and the group were justified in their self-defense, so they shouldn't face serious trouble. The officer also said he'd arrange for someone to come fix their car, then rode off on his bike. When the others returned, Paul told them about the officer's visit. They cleaned the blood off the car, waiting for the mechanic to arrive. Suddenly, a vicious dog appeared on their path, baring its teeth aggressively. Looking closer, they realized it was Justin's dog. But how had this gentle dog from the night before turned so ferocious overnight? And where was Justin himself? At that moment, Marcy appeared carrying a hunting rifle and fired a warning shot, scaring the dog away. Back inside the cabin, worries resurfaced. What if the man they had set on fire had died? If the police found his body, they'd be finished. Even if the man somehow survived, they could still face serious charges for assault. The group grew more anxious as they discussed their options. After much debate, they decided it was best to come clean at the town's police station. But waiting around wasn't a solution either. They weren't sure if the unreliable cop would really send a mechanic as promised. So, they decided to try fixing the car themselves and leave this nightmare behind as soon as possible. During the work, Karen suddenly felt unwell and went back to her room alone to rest. Marcy, exhausted, planned to take a shower to relax. Jeff and Bert took charge of repairing the car. Meanwhile, Paul quietly slipped into Karen's room and thoughtfully brought her a glass of tap water. After Karen drank, Paul prepared to leave. To his surprise, Karen asked him to stay. Paul's quiet kindness had finally won her approval. Just as Paul was about to make a move to take their relationship further, he suddenly felt something sticky on Karen's thigh. Panicked, he pulled back the blanket and was horrified to find Karen's thigh was raw and bloody, just like the infected man they had encountered earlier. It was obvious she had been infected after drinking the contaminated tap water. Frightened, Paul rushed to the bathroom to wash the blood off his hands. Hearing the commotion, the others quickly came to check, and when they realized Karen was infected, panic spread through the group. They immediately isolated her to prevent further contamination. Then they started checking each other carefully, hoping none of them showed symptoms. After confirming they seemed all clear, they decided, just to be safe, to isolate Karen in a small cabin outside. Karen was terrified and begged them not to lock her away like that, but there was nothing anyone could do except quietly close the door. Determined to save his goddess, Paul had no choice but to sneak out late at night to seek help. Soon, he spotted a lit-up house nearby and decided to ask the occupant for assistance. But through the window, he accidentally saw a naked woman lying inside. Curious, Karen had taken a few extra glances, which caught the attention of the woman's husband. Paul tried to deny seeing anything, but the man wasn't buying it. Filled with rage, the man was ready to shoot Paul on the spot, let alone offer any help. Paul was so scared that he immediately ran back to the cabin, gasping for breath as he told Bert he had found nothing. Marcy prepared dinner for everyone, but no one dared to eat, fearing that Karen's contaminated bowl might have been used. Jeff suggested that they all keep their distance. Even though no one showed symptoms yet, that didn't mean no one was infected. Still, while avoiding close contact, they needed to help each other as best they could. In this tense situation, Bert had long since forgotten their earlier bet to only drink beer and no water. He went ahead and drank a glass of tap water. Suddenly, outside, the barking of a dog broke the silence. They all crouched by the window and saw the vicious dog trying to break into the cabin where Karen was isolated. The group fired warning shots to scare the dog away and decided that Bert should stay right outside the cabin to keep watch, just in case. The next morning, Bert excitedly announced that he had finally fixed the car, and they were ready to leave for the town immediately. Karen's condition could no longer be delayed. What they didn't know was that because Bert had drunk the contaminated tap water the night before, he had already started showing infection symptoms. But despite knowing he was infected, Bert chose not to tell his companions. Afraid of being abandoned, he tried his best to act as if everything was normal. Just as they were about to help Karen into the car, she suddenly coughed up a mouthful of blood, staining the entire driver's seat crimson. Fearing infection, no one dared to get in the car with her, so they had no choice but to lay Karen back down on the ground. Given her condition, it was uncertain whether she could even survive the trip to town. Jeff kept his distance, too afraid to come close. Only Marcy and Paul ignored the danger and stayed by Karen's side, caring for her as best they could. Seeing Karen's tragic state, Bert immediately panicked. All he could think about was escaping down the mountain as fast as possible, even if it meant abandoning Karen. Maybe, just maybe, he could save himself. Paul grew suspicious of Bert's strange behavior and asked if he might be infected too. Feeling guilty, Bert didn't answer. Instead, he said he was going to town to find a doctor, then floored the gas and sped off. Jeff sensed the situation was spiraling out of control. He grabbed some beers from the fridge, preparing to run off on his own. He didn't want to end up like Karen. Since Paul and Marcy had no protection and had been in direct contact with the infected, It was only a matter of time before they caught the virus. Out of self-preservation, Jeff chose to selfishly abandon even his friends and girlfriend. Anything to get away from this nightmare. It wasn't until then that Marcy truly saw her boyfriend for who he really was. When disaster struck, no one could be trusted. After settling Karen once again in the wooden cabin, Marcy returned to her room, overwhelmed with helpless tears. Her companion was hanging by a thread, and her boyfriend's cold abandonment shattered her completely. She feared that she too might end up like Karen, infected by the virus, dying a painful death. Soon, they all might be infected. If she couldn't control her fate, then why not live for the moment? Sharing a glance filled with despair, Marcy and Paul immediately moved closer to each other. Afterward, Paul worried about Marcy possibly being infected, so he hurried to the bathroom to disinfect himself. But what they didn't realize was that Marcy's back had already begun to show red blotches. Earlier events had made it clear. Since Marcy had come into contact with the contaminated tap water while showering, her infection was inevitable. Meanwhile, Bert had stopped at the convenience store they passed earlier and urgently sought help from the owner. He told the man that a contagious disease had broken out at their campsite, that his friends had already been infected and were now critically ill, desperate for medical aid. Though Bert again hid the fact that he himself was sick, the owner noticed his unusual condition and warned him to stay away. Then, he went inside to call for a doctor. But what no one expected was that just as the owner went inside, his son suddenly fell ill. The owner tried to stop him, but it was too late. The boy lunged at Bert and bit him, while also getting exposed to the virus-laden blood himself. This move was a double-edged sword, hurting the enemy, but causing even greater harm to themselves. Watching helplessly as his son became infected, the owner's anger erupted. He could tolerate Bert stealing and his foul mouth, but his children were everything to him. He had already lost his eldest son, and if it weren't for Bert's arrival, his youngest wouldn't have been in danger. Blaming everything on Bert, the owner called for a hunting rifle, determined to deal with the troublemaker once and for all. Realizing the danger, Bert quickly fled. But the owner wasn't about to let him escape easily. With his family in tow, he gave chase. After a fierce pursuit, Bert drove his car into a dead end and had no choice but to abandon it and run into the woods on foot. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Paul wasn't about to just sit and wait for doom. He decided to leave Marcy behind and go find Jeff. They had to get out of there immediately. Following Jeff's path, Paul arrived at the reservoir and spotted a body floating in the water. To be sure it was the man they'd set on fire, Paul grabbed a nearby ladder and used a stick to flip the corpse over. The truth was clear, but the old ladder was rusty and fragile. In his excitement, Paul slipped and fell right into the water, coming into close contact with the infected corpse. The virus-tainted water went straight down, infecting him too. Struggling, Paul finally climbed out. Seeing the reservoir sign nearby, it hit him. Karen had gotten infected because she drank water from this reservoir. Meanwhile, Marcy, left alone at the cabin, noticed her condition worsening. Her skin was breaking down everywhere. Wrapped in a bathrobe, she staggered out of the cabin in despair, only to be spotted by the vicious dog. Marcy ran back toward the cabin, desperate to get inside. But before she could make it, the dog pounced, and she became its prey. When Paul rushed back to the cabin, all that was left of Marcy was a bloody mess on the ground. Even Karen inside the cabin hadn't survived. Seeing Paul, the dog lunged at him next. In a split second, Paul grabbed the nearby hunting rifle and took a clean shot, putting the dog down for good. Paul then went over to Karen and was horrified to find that she had been torn apart beyond recognition. To end her suffering, he had no choice but to put her down. After handling everything, Paul was ready to get out of that cursed place. But when he opened the door, he was shocked to see Bert, badly wounded. From Bert, Paul learned about the convenience store owner's relentless hunt for him. Not long after, the owner and his group arrived. They kicked down the door and found Bert sitting inside with a hunting rifle, but Bert was too weak to fire. In the next moment, a long-haired man shot Bert dead. What they didn't know was that Bert was just bait. As the long-haired man gloated, Paul, who had been hiding in the shadows, suddenly sprang into action. In an incredible fight, Paul managed to take on 3 enemies and turn the tables. At this point, Jeff was the only one left alive. Paul started searching everywhere for Jeff. When he passed by a cave, he noticed a faint light inside. Thinking it was Jeff, he cautiously entered, only to find Justin's corpse already turned. At that moment, Paul gave up on finding Jeff and just wanted to escape as fast as possible. He ran down the path and suddenly spotted Bert and the convenience store owner's car blocking the road. Without hesitation, Paul jumped into the car and sped off, desperate to get away from the nightmare. But along the way, Paul got distracted for just a moment and accidentally crashed into a wild deer. The car was totaled. Just then, he heard a commotion nearby. Curious, he went to check it out and found that same police officer throwing a party with a group of young people. Paul wanted to know why the promised mechanic never showed up. When he confronted the cop, the officer claimed he had already called a tow truck, but the truck had broken down on the way. The excuse sounded pretty flimsy, and Paul didn't buy it for a second. Still, he didn't have time to argue. All he cared about was getting out of there. The cop agreed to take him to town, but before they could leave, the sheriff's voice came over the radio.
Kids up in the cabin are on a killing spree. There's 2, possibly 3 casualties already.
Before the officer could react, the partygoers lost their patience. A guy with a hat grabbed a guitar and attacked first. But instead of knocking Paul down, he accidentally hit one of his own friends, and Paul quickly pinned him down on the car hood, infecting him. Terrified, the others jumped in their cars and sped away. The cop was still blaming Paul for ruining his party. Paul had had enough. He grabbed a wooden stick and knocked the cop out cold. Then he ran for it. Eventually, when he reached the main road, he collapsed from exhaustion. A passing truck driver found him and kindly took him to the hospital. Paul was rushed into a hospital room. When he woke up from his coma, the sheriff was already there, demanding answers about the virus's origin. At this point, Paul saw no reason to keep quiet any longer and told them everything about the man they'd encountered in the woods. Unfortunately, the town's medical facilities were limited, and Paul's condition was too severe. They decided to send him to a bigger hospital to see if there was any hope left. On the surface, the sheriff claimed he wanted to get Paul proper treatment. But behind the scenes, he secretly ordered his unreliable officer to eliminate Paul. After all, such a huge incident could ruin their reputations if it got out. Meanwhile, Jeff hadn't gone far. He returned to the cabin and witnessed the grim aftermath. Strangely, he didn't mourn the loss of his friends, but was relieved to be the sole survivor. To cover up the truth, the sheriff had Jeff killed as well. The bodies and the entire cabin were burned to erase all evidence. The sheriff foolishly believed this would destroy every trace of the virus and the incident. What he didn't know was that a corpse still lay in the reservoir, the real source of the disaster, something Paul never mentioned. Adding insult to injury, the unreliable officer carelessly dumped Paul's body by the riverbank. Downstream, 2 children drew water to make lemonade, setting up a little stand outside the convenience store. The sheriff and his men, fresh from their dirty work, became the kids' first customers. And so, in the end, every single person in that small town unknowingly drank the lemonade, 5 cents a cup, made with water from the very same contaminated stream. That's it for today's video. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, don't miss the next one. See you soon.